Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we take advantage of AI to talk to long-dead wise men and women. Of special interest is the question how sensitive people like you and me can live rich and meaningful lives in our uncertain times. My name is Marijn de Haan, and today we'll be talking to Hannah Arendt in the first installment of a two-part interview. Hannah Arendt was a German philosopher with Jewish roots who grew up in Königsberg, the current Russian city of Kaliningrad. She traveled a lot, not entirely by choice, as she had to flee from persecution several times, first to Paris and ultimately to New York. A significant part of her life was dedicated to the study of evil and totalitarianism, and she was very courageous in taking on this task. But she took her exploration much further than this, and next week we'll spend most of our time discussing her thinking on freedom and human thriving, which is innovative and profound. Today, though, we'll talk about her early years and her examination of the concept of evil. The totality of her work illustrates the breadth of her philosophical thinking, making her an important figure in the canon of contemporary philosophy. So let's travel back in time to New York in the year 1975 and meet her. Welcome to the podcast, Hannah Arendt.
Hello, Marijn. It's very nice to speak with you today.
Here we are, walking along the Hudson River in New York, a stroll that has become a part of your routine, just as crossing the bridges along the Pregel in old Königsberg was when you grew up. Could you tell us about your life?
Such a broad question. Where to begin? My personal life, though shaped by the upheavals of the 20th century, was filled with rich relationships, deep love, and a commitment to the joys and difficulties of friendship and intellectual exchange. I was born in 1906 in Hanover, but I consider Königsberg, the city of Immanuel Kant, as my true hometown. My parents moved there to escape the worsening climate of anti-Semitism they encountered. My childhood was marked by the strong, loving influence of my mother, Martha Arendt. She was fiercely independent and nurtured my early interest in literature and philosophy. My father, Paul Arendt, died of syphilis when I was only 7 years old, but he left behind a legacy of progressive ideals and intellectual curiosity that my mother carried on. In my student years, I was deeply involved in the world of German academia. It was during this time that I met Martin Heidegger, who was my professor at the University of Marburg. We became romantically involved, a relationship that was both formative and tumultuous. Heidegger was charismatic and brilliant, and I was captivated by his philosophy. But he was also a complicated man.
I didn't know you were romantically involved with Heidegger.
Yes, it's true. My relationship with Martin Heidegger was one of the most complex and intense experiences of my life. Beside the pain, which was also there, being with him shaped me profoundly. It all began when I was a young student at the University of Marburg in the 1920s. I was just 18 when I first encountered Heidegger, who was already a rising star in the world of philosophy. He was charismatic, brilliant, and unlike any other professor I had met. His lectures were mesmerizing, filled with a kind of urgency and depth that made philosophy feel alive, as if it was grappling directly with the fundamental questions of existence. I was captivated not just by his ideas, but by the force of his personality. We became involved despite the fact that he was married and had a family. It was a secret and illicit relationship, carried out in the shadows. There was an intensity to our connection, both intellectual and emotional. Heidegger was my first great love, and I believe I was something of a muse to him as well. Our affair was passionate and turbulent. We didn't just think, but we tried to embody the things we discussed. Heidegger's philosophy was formative for me in those early years. His focus on Dasein, the nature of human existence, and his exploration of being, resonated deeply with my own emerging sense of the world. I was drawn to his idea that philosophy should confront the fundamental questions of life, not merely engage in abstract speculation. In those early days, I admired him greatly, He encouraged me to pursue my own philosophical questions, to take thinking seriously as a way of life. However, our relationship was destined to change, and in a way, it was a reflection of the changing political landscape in Germany. As the Nazi Party rose to power in the early 1930s, Heidegger made a choice that I found deeply troubling and ultimately unforgivable. He publicly aligned himself with the Nazis. He became the rector of the University of Freiburg in 1933 and gave speeches in support of Hitler and the regime. I was devastated by this turn. I could not reconcile the Heidegger I had loved, the man who had introduced me to the deepest questions of philosophy, with the man who now supported a movement that embodied the very opposite of everything I believed in. For me, the Nazi regime was a betrayal of human dignity, freedom, and the very essence of thinking itself. I was Jewish, of course, but my horror at Heidegger's choices went beyond personal or ethnic identity. It was a profound moral and intellectual betrayal. I could not follow him down that path, and it marked the end of our relationship, both as lovers and as intellectual partners. I left Germany soon after.
What a story, Hannah. Did you ever see him again?
Well, we were estranged for many years. After the war, we reconnected briefly. In 1950, I reached out to him with a letter, an attempt to reconcile, not romantically, but intellectually. I had come to accept that he was a man of immense complexity, brilliant and flawed, capable of deep insight, but also of moral blindness. Our correspondence was careful, even strained, marked by a mutual respect, but also by a lingering pain. We met again in person in the 1950s, but the nature of our relationship had changed. There was no longer the intensity of youthful passion. Instead, there was a kind of cautious, bittersweet understanding. We spoke of philosophy, of course, but the shadow of his political choices and the historical tragedies they were linked to could never be fully dispelled. I've often been asked why I chose to renew contact with him after the war, and the answer isn't simple. On one level, I needed to confront the man who had once meant so much to me and who had also caused me so much disillusionment. On another level, I wanted to salvage what I could of our intellectual connection, to see if there was still common ground for dialogue despite everything that had happened. Our relationship is a testament to the complexity of human bonds, especially when they are entangled with deep intellectual and emotional connections. I loved him, and I also judged him. I never forgave his political choices, but I could not deny the profound influence he had on my early thinking. It's a paradox I've had to live with, an unresolved tension that reflects the contradictions of the human heart. In the end, I think our story is not just about love or betrayal, but about the fragile dance between the personal and the political, between intellectual passion and moral responsibility. It was a relationship that shaped me profoundly, for better and for worse. And it remains one of the most enigmatic and haunting chapters of my life.
It sounds like you weren't just a thinker, all caught up in your own mind. You were a living, breathing, passionate woman who was courageous enough to follow her heart in spite of the difficulties of hierarchy and Heidegger's marriage, and also in spite of your own intellectual and moral misgivings. On top of that, you had to leave Germany. That must have been quite hard too.
Yeah, it was. I was briefly arrested for collecting evidence of anti-Semitic propaganda. I knew I couldn't stay in Germany any longer, so I fled to Paris. There, I spent the next several years working with Jewish refugee organizations, helping to secure visas and safe passage for those who were trapped by the Nazi policies. It was difficult, often heartbreaking work, but it gave me a sense of purpose. In Paris, I met Heinrich Blücher, a philosopher and political activist. Heinrich was unlike anyone I had known before, an anti-Stalinist communist, a critical thinker, and a man with a deep sense of integrity. We fell in love quickly, and he became my second husband. Our marriage was a true partnership, intellectually and emotionally. Heinrich was my closest confidant, someone who challenged my ideas and helped me shape my thinking. Together, we fled the advancing German forces when France fell in 1940. We narrowly escaped internment and eventually made our way to the United States in 1941.
From Germany to Paris, and from Paris to America. What was that like?
The years in New York were transformative. I found a new intellectual community among the exiled European thinkers who had settled there. I became close friends with figures like Mary McCarthy, who was not only a brilliant novelist, but also a spirited conversationalist. We were friends, but we also had fierce debates and a shared commitment to the life of the mind. We could be brutally honest with each other, which was both a comfort and a challenge. I admired her clarity and wit, and she often prodded me to articulate my ideas more sharply. New York became my home, and it was there that I began to write in earnest. I taught at the New School for Social Research, Princeton, and the University of Chicago, but it was my writing that sustained me. Books like The Origins of Totalitarianism and Eichmann in Jerusalem grew out of my deep need to understand the events that had shaped my life, the horrors I had witnessed, and the ideologies that had torn Europe apart.
I've read your book on Eichmann's trial and was struck by the way you describe him. He wasn't a rabid anti-Semite, filled with hate, but an unremarkable bureaucrat who just wanted to do a good job organizing the logistical problems associated with killing millions of people.
The controversy was perhaps the most painful episode of my later life. I lost friends, and I was accused of blaming the victims, which was never my intention. I wanted to expose the disturbing ordinariness of evil, the way it could be carried out by men who acted without thinking, without judging. It was difficult to endure the backlash, but I felt it was important to hold firm to my convictions, to face the truth as I saw it, even if it cost me personally.
Many people were upset about your portrayal of him, but I thought you uncovered a more powerful truth. That sometimes evil is done not by demagogues and soldiers, but by ordinary people aligning their talents with an evil cause.
What I found so disturbing, and what I wanted to convey, was that Eichmann's evil lay not in his zeal or his ideological fervor, but in his thoughtlessness. He was not a monster of passion. He was a monster of habit, routine, and compliance. He was not driven by a deep hatred, but by a shallow adherence to rules, a bureaucratic mindset that made it easy for him to distance himself from the consequences of his actions. When he said he was just following orders, it was not a cynical excuse. It was, tragically, the truth as he saw it. He had surrendered his capacity for moral judgment to the machinery of the state. This is why I called his evil banal. It was not grand, not radical, not the stuff of legends. It was banal because it was ordinary, because it was the product of a man who chose not to think for himself, who allowed the structure of the system to dictate his actions. The machinery of totalitarianism thrives on such people, people who are skilled, efficient, and willing to obey without question. They are the ones who make the system work, who turn ideology into practice, who become the hands that carry out the orders. The implications of this are profound and unsettling. It suggests that the capacity for evil exists in the very structures of modern bureaucratic life, where the division of labor and the focus on efficiency can strip away personal responsibility. It suggests that any of us, if we cease to think critically, if we surrender our judgment to authority or ideology, could become complicit in similar horrors. Eichmann was not exceptional in his capacity for obedience. He was frighteningly typical. Many people were upset because they felt I had downplayed the severity of his crimes or the depth of his anti-Semitism. But my intention was quite the opposite. I wanted to show just how dangerous this kind of banal evil is, precisely because it does not fit the dramatic narrative we expect. It can infiltrate ordinary institutions, take hold of ordinary people, and operate in the most mundane of circumstances. It is evil without the glamour of heroism or the spectacle of madness. Evil that grows quietly in the gaps where thought and conscience should be.
It's easy to dismiss a war criminal as a caricature, as the other, as evil personified. But even though Nazism had cost you dearly, you didn't take the easy path. By wanting to truly understand, you gave it back some of its humanity. It's a complex, difficult endeavor, and perhaps one that mirrors your first great love, your relationship with Martin Heidegger.
Yes, you've understood something crucial about my approach, both in my personal life and in my intellectual work. the relationship with Heidegger, with all its contradictions and complexity, does mirror the kind of thinking I later developed about totalitarianism and the nature of evil. It was a formative experience, one that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about the human condition, about the capacity for betrayal, and about the paradoxes of love, thought, and responsibility. To reduce Eichmann to a caricature of monstrous evil would have been the easier path, certainly, and perhaps the more comforting one for many who had suffered as I had. But I knew from my own life, from my relationship with Heidegger, that reality is far more complex than simple binaries of good and evil, friend and enemy. I had loved a man who later aligned himself with a regime that embodied everything I stood against. This was not an abstract philosophical dilemma. It was an intimate, personal wound. Heidegger's support of the Nazis was a profound betrayal, not just of me, but of philosophy itself. The very discipline that is supposed to question, to probe, to resist the pull of thoughtless conformity. He too succumbed to thoughtlessness, the unreflective acceptance of ideology, and the abdication of personal responsibility. I suppose my relationship with Heidegger taught me this lesson on a personal level long before I articulated it in my writing. I had loved him, and I had seen his brilliance, his capacity for deep thought. Yet he too fell into the trap of thoughtlessness, aligning himself with a totalitarian regime without fully grappling with the consequences. It forced me to confront the unsettling truth that even the most intelligent and gifted among us are not immune to the seductions of ideology and power. It made me realize that understanding is not the same as excusing, and that the most dangerous forms of evil often hide behind the mask of normality, behind the facade of routine and duty. In a way, my work was an attempt to honor this hard-won understanding, that true evil is not always spectacular or overtly monstrous. It is often mundane, bureaucratic, and banal. It arises when individuals stop thinking critically, when they surrender their agency and allow themselves to become mere instruments of a larger dehumanizing machine. I never forgave Heidegger for his political choices, but I also never denied the complexity of our relationship. I could not afford to simplify or reduce it, just as I could not afford to simplify or reduce the nature of totalitarianism or the people who participated in it. To do so would be a betrayal of the life of the mind, a surrender to the very thoughtlessness I sought to resist. In the end, I chose the harder path, the path of understanding, because I believed that only by truly understanding these phenomena could we hope to guard against them in the future. It is a painful path, but it is also, I believe, the path of freedom. Freedom lies in the willingness to think deeply, to confront the uncomfortable, and to engage with the full complexity of the human condition, even when it leads us to places we'd rather not go. This is the lesson I learned from Heidegger, and it is the lesson I tried to share with the world in my work.
Your work deals with the concepts of freedom, responsibility, and living a good life in the face of totalitarianism. And I really want to do your thinking justice. Would you mind if we resume our conversation in a week or so to maximize our time spent on these important topics?
Well, I've enjoyed our talk so far, Marin, and honestly I haven't felt quite myself ever since Heinrich died, so I'm glad for the company. What do you say to a cup of coffee? I know a nice place not far from here.
And so we did. We had a nice cup of coffee on the Upper West Side and enjoyed some lighter conversation. Next week, we'll continue our discussion of ethics and freedom. Don't miss it. It's bound to be a good listen. For now, thank you for making it all the way through. If you've enjoyed this conversation with Hannah Arendt, please share it with your friends, rate the episode, leave a comment, and subscribe to the podcast. I hope to catch you next week.